From Los Angeles, the home of film and television, this is Film Music Live, a webcast featuring outstanding composers, orchestrators, filmmakers, and more from the world of music for film, television, and video games, talking about their work and answering your questions. Film Music Live is sponsored by the Film Music Network and Film Music Institute. And now the host of Film Music Live, Daniel Schweiger.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel Schweiger, and welcome to Film Music Live, the show where you get to ask the questions to today's top composers. I'm happy to have you here. Stephen Price professionally walked two worlds in between apprenticing for Trevor Jones and then music editing for the likes of Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard's Batman Begins and Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and Return of the King, all while being determined to create his own scoring sound. It would be producer Edgar Wright who gave Price his big feature break when scoring Joe Cornish's energetic Attack the Block, a soundtrack that showed Price's pulse on cutting-edge tunes as well as old-fashioned musical construction. Price would find his third piece dealing with outer space was the best score charm with Gravity, as well as accompanying the violent misfits of David Ayer's Suicide Squad and Fury, among his Emmy-winning documentary duties for David Attenborough's A Life on Our Planet. Through an increasingly busy career that firmly put him in the composing world, Price continued to find his wildest scores in the company of Edgar Wright, from the alien invasion pub The World's End to taking on the boyfriends of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, and the propulsive rhythms of Baby Driver. Now, Price and Wright team for literally their craziest and most suspensefully intoxicating pop-oriented score with the dual-period mystery of Last Night in Soho. It's a murderous quantum leap for fashion designer Eloise as she trips between modern times and 1966 London to become the club singer Sandy, who'd meet a killer end. As Eloise tries to solve the murder mystery while sinking into another woman's body, Price warps such classic songs as Downtown, There's Always Something There to Remind Me, and You're My World, with a surreal score that captures a swinging London 60s vibe as transmuted to knife-cutting edge trance rhythms and backward sampling. Voices within a potentially crazy character's head mixed with Italian giallo vibes and eerie female vocalese, while strongly thematic symphonic melodies add to the feeling of a brain melting into madness a la Rosemary's Baby. As one of Stephen Price's most strikingly inventive scores, Last Night in Soho is the ultimate retro trip with danger lying in both musical eras. And now joining us from England, where he's time and hour tripping on a night near Soho, is composer Stephen Price. Welcome to Film Music Live, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you. How you doing?
Oh, it's great to have you here. What I would have to ask is that you really kind of came up through the music editing system. You temped. You worked with other composers and then ultimately would win the Oscar for Best Score for Gravity. What was that whole process like of literally kind of starting as a music editor?
I mean, looking back on it, it was fantastic because it's one of the best ways of learning all the different worlds of film music. You know, it was you're working really closely with the cutting room, you're working with directors and editors, but composers, music teams, you're kind of part of the whole thing. I mean, for me, it was I got into it accidentally. I was literally working at Abbey Road for Trevor Jones at the time, and they were looking to set up a team for Lord of the Rings, and I was asked if I wanted to join this team, and of course you go, yes please. But I didn't really know what a music editor was at that point, and through that I ended up doing all these other things in music editorial, and then it became this kind of like, this is all very exciting, and I'm getting to work on some big films, but how do I get to the thing that I was always wanting to do? How do I get back onto that track? So that was kind of tricky for me, but looking back on it, the experience I got was incredible. And yeah, every day I'm kind of grateful for the things I learned through that sort of process.
What were some of the particularly memorable experiences you had during that process of becoming a composer?
Well, I mean, every film was different, really. I mean, I used to get a lot of music editorial gigs that were kind of the odd films, you know, things where we're not going to hire a composer on this, we're just going to use songs. You know, that sort of thing would be said. And that was a film like The Boat That Rocked I did for Richard Curtis, where, you know, ostensibly it was just going to be a lot of songs chopped together. But of course it never is. And there's always a little bit of connective tissue needed. There's always something needed. And you just get to fill in the gaps, you know, and you gradually kind of get people's confidence with that sort of thing. And Scott Pilgrim was a job like that. I started on that film as the music editor, and Nigel Godrich, the Radiohead producer, was the composer on it. But orchestral things wasn't so much his bag, so I would end up doing a lot of that, and I'd end up writing additional bits. And gradually it became, the door started to open again. But the whole ride of it was great, and just being around, composers having their meetings with directors and things like that, and seeing the different ways that can go down. And being in cutting rooms when things are changing and then they're nothing to do with music, because it's very easy to sit on the music side of things and you get a new cut of the picture and it's changed and they've ruined your fantastic 4-minute cue that you've loved and worked on for weeks, and you immediately take it very personally. Whereas actually the reason maybe, something entirely, they couldn't get the VFX shot right, or they've had a note about one line of dialogue and they've got to move it. There's all these other things that are going on that you can kind of look at it from different angles. And so music editorial was great for me to just learn that and to see that, music is part of this big jigsaw basically in a film.
Now, you also, as a music editor, you do what I do professionally, which is temp tracking and working with other composers' cues. How did that help you in terms of you becoming a composer?
Well, the interesting thing about that is it's you all have found this, that when you've done that for a while, you develop this kind of sixth sense, and you could look at a film, and 4 or 5 different ways that film could be scored would occur to you, because you'd kind of been in that world for so long that you could kind of hear it. And so, if you've got those 4 or 5 ideas of how you could how other people's music could score a film, to me, the job of composing is, okay, what's the next one? What's the 6th one? What's the one that no one's done yet? And so that's kind of how I tend to look at things now. How can I make this absolutely distinct to the film? I don't want this to sound like it's been temp tracked with anything else. I don't want this to sound like any other film. Really, I don't want this music to be tempted into another film. I want it to be so right for this film. You can't imagine it anywhere else. And kind of that's how I go at things nowadays.
Now, again, I want to give a big shout out to Backlot Music for giving 5 downloads of Edgar's awesome score to Last Night in Soho to the first 5 questions. And we've got our first one from Eric. And he'd like to know, could you talk a bit about how your relationship with director Edgar Wright has evolved over the past decade?
Yeah, I mean, it's been one of the great relationships of my professional life, really. I mean, as you said in your lovely introduction, he basically gave me my break back into the writing. It was through Scott Pilgrim and me doing additional music on that I got the opportunity to write on Attack the Block, which Joe Cornish directed, but Edgar was producing. And since then, The World's End and beyond. And the great thing about the way that's evolved is like anything, when you've known someone for a long time, you've got this shared language now, and you've got this way of communicating very, very quickly, which means you can get stuff done and you can get rid of all that nervousness. You don't have that bit at the beginning of a project where you're presenting your ideas for the first time and, oh God, are they going to hate it? Are they going to like it? Are they going to fire me? There's all these things that kind of play on your paranoid mind at that part of a project. We don't have that anymore. I can just read the script as I did on Soho, and that will suggest some ideas. There'll be images described in the script, and that will inspire me to write something. And I can just send him that, even if it's a little rough around the edges, just going like, "Well, do you think there's anything in this?" And there's no nervousness in that for me. And I'm kind of confident that he's going to respond to that in whichever way he responds to it, and his feedback's going to inspire me to do something else. So it's just a great system whereby you can just work really openly and know that you're all pushing in the same direction. And there's something to be said for the techniques you build up over the years as well. It's like, oh, you remember we did that thing there? Let's do something like that, but do it differently this time. All that stuff. It's really it's something I enjoy a lot working with him.
Now, I mean, I think with directors, songs are so essential to Edgar's work. With Scott Pilgrim, and especially with Baby Driver, where it was almost kind of hard to, okay, where is this score? Is this a song? And in Soho, it just climaxes. As a big fan of the '60s, is like, for me, his best soundtrack yet. But how has that worked with kind of like fitting yourself between this kind of nonstop hit parade to the point of Last Night in Soho?
But I think, Baby Driver, as you mentioned, that was songs all the way, really, and the score in that was very much connective tissue. It was finding ways to supplement songs and support songs, and then get to the next song and link keys, and it was kind of a technical thing. There were themes in there for one of the characters had his own sort of scored theme, but for the most part, I was fitting around it. Soho kind of starts in that sort of way, and the first third of the film is definitely very songs orientated, and we get introduced to the 60s, and we enter that world, but gradually score takes over. And so there were a couple of components to my work on Soho, really, one of which was working with the songs. And again, the working with Edgar it's not like you have a needle drop song and that's it, this is this sacred object. We kind of want to make it work for the film, and that might mean me joining and juxtaposing something odd with the orchestra against that song. It might mean us stretching things. It might mean the score gradually takes over. There's several moments in Last Night in Soho where the song will begin and the score is kind of playing something a little different underneath it, and gradually it's the score that takes over and lifts the scene onto the next area. And there's some songs that we totally transform during that process. There's a sequence with Sandy Shaw's Always Something There to Remind Me, where really that becomes this nightmarish kind of Revolution No. 9 vision during the course of this really intense sequence as Eloise runs through central London. So yeah, that was the way the song thing, but this one had a much bigger kind of score side to it as well. And there was space for themes in this, and there was space for things that would play in a more conventional way. And certainly as the film gets into its more kind of horror side, I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying that the score
we're beyond spoilers.
Good. We're beyond that weekend.
I mean, now were the songs like, there's always something there to remind me, and of course Downtown, were they always in the script, or was this discussed with you, obviously maybe even before shooting began?
Oftentimes they're in the script. I think for the most part the songs were all in the script in Last Night in Soho, because I know that when he's writing, he often is playing those and he's imagining kind of how he's going to cut to the rhythms of the songs. And that was how we met actually back on the scripting process of Baby Driver back in 2007, was me working with him to what could we do with these songs, how would a rhythm work, would that work with the speed of a windscreen wiper, those sort of odd conversations that you find on a movie. So yeah, they're all in the script, but what isn't explored at that stage is what we might do with them. And certainly something like the You're My World sequence at the end of Last Night in Soho, where we re-recorded that song in a couple of different ways, and Anya Taylor-Joy, who's one of our lead actors, performs it in a very sort of skewed kind of way to fit what's going on with the story at that point. Those things evolved through the process of it, and we kind of worked at those as the process of post went on.
One thing I particularly love in the score is this kind of mash between the periods, and then suddenly you start going off into different stylistic directions. Like you've got giallo organs in it, and you've got this really cool what I call like a massive attack. The band, feeling to a lot of the instrumentation. How did you want to fuse essentially the idea of this kind of nightmarish time tripping into the score?
Well, the 60s was obviously the key to it, in that the whole film is this idea that we all see the 60s as this amazing era and everything was wonderful and shiny and wasn't exciting and let's go there. But the reality, obviously, like every era, was a lot darker. And so the 60s is kind of leaching through time in the film. It's based on someone who's looking back on this era with this great sort of, oh, it was fantastic, and gradually finding out this awful reality of things and this particular situation someone finds themselves in. So I wanted the 60s instrumentation to feel very real, and to find ways to make that feel like it's kind of come through time and we now see it differently. So I would use a lot of 60s kind of techniques, and like you've noticed, there's this various more bandy sort of approaches to the instrumentation. There's a lot of guitars, there's a lot of drums, bass, Hammond organs. The strings, where there are strings in the more 60s side of things, they're kind of quite close mic'd, and lots of woodwind sections, which in my mind were sort of vaguely John Barry-esque, although I can't do that thing, but it's got that sort of hint to it. And then gradually, as we got into the modern day, and these two worlds do collide and kind of melt together, there was room for much more processing of that idea, and the orchestra starts to expand as we get into the thick of things in the second half. And a lot of the ideas that I'd set up in the first half of the film, they loop around, and literally tape loops on occasion. There's things where little lines of dialogue are looping and gradually degrading as we get later on in the film, and these memories of the past, these echoes of the past, are getting more and more distorted. And instrumentally we do that as well. There's some really clear statements of themes early on in the film which are kind of messier and kind of more distorted later on. So hopefully it feels like, you know, this beautiful idea that we have of the 60s gradually gets more distorted as Eloise's experience gets wilder.
And that actually goes to a question from Sachi Danan. How important is sound design in your scoring process? Do you create your sonic palettes specific to a project, or you build it from time to time? I mean, was Soho done specifically for Soho, or was there a bag of tricks?
They're all kind of, every film I tend to start from scratch. I mean, I a lot of the times now I will spend a good few weeks at the start of a project just writing stuff, and I won't necessarily do it to picture, and I may never play it to anybody. You know, with Edgar, I do play it to him, and it was a really useful process on this. But you know, often I'll just play with my palette and try and work out a palette and see what makes this film sort of unique. I mean, a big belief of mine is that there's always something on the screen that's going to tell me the answer to the film. I just have to spend enough time with the film to find out what that is. You know, and a film like Fury that I did years ago for David Ayer, you know, it's this heavy treading tank kind of movie, and the weight of that and metallic noises and metal things being stretched was the answer. And with this, the idea of kind of echoes through time seemed to be the answer, and it was a way of finding ways to make things that felt like they were kind of quite grainy and 60s, and kind of but close and fresh in your mind as those records are at the same time, and then finding a way of making that sort of merge. So yeah, all the films start with this dream of making something that's really bespoke to that project and couldn't possibly be in one of the other ones. And I'm sure you can hear bits of me sort of returning to things that I do naturally in all of them, but I'm always trying to find a fresh kind of way for each film.
This is kind of like Gravity. If there's like one score that this kind of threw me back to from your repertoire, it would be Gravity, I think.
Really? Well, there's probably quite a lot of processing and things and playing with voices. You know, Gravity was a very voice intensive score, and there's an awful lot of voice in this film as well. This idea that the siren song of Sandy, who's Anya Taylor-Joy's character, is kind of singing to us through the film, and she's calling forward to the future, was something that we did, and I worked with her a lot to record. She's the singer in the score, which was a treat to do.
Yeah, and actually that takes us to Dale's question. What was the process of interacting with one of the main actors in the film, Anya Taylor-Joy, and contributing so many voices to Soho's score? And again, I have to digress because, you know, a lot of people kind of, and I actually kind of compared it to Rosemary's Baby or even Clute with, you know, the la 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 la. But actually, in the reality, if there's one film that this film really harkens to, it's Compulsion. It's oh my God, I'm having a brain fart. The Roman Polanski's film with Catherine Deneuve, Repulsion.
Repulsion, right.
Yeah, that's the movie. But where did the idea of the voices come in again? Again, I would have had no idea it was Anna's unless Dale told me.
Well, it came from a line in the script and a scene in the film where Sandy, who's Anya's character, is auditioning to be a performer at this club in London, the Rialto Club. And the idea was that she sings the song Downtown. And this was always in the script, but we didn't know quite what the reality of that was going to be and how it was going to happen. Were we going to have a band? How was she going to do it? And we didn't really know, you know, if Anya was a singer or if she was confident doing that, because it's quite an intense thing to do, stand on a stage with all those cameras and perform. And so I went to the set early one morning with a piano player friend and Edgar, and we basically just did a little rehearsal. And within 5 minutes of sitting down with Anya, she was singing Downtown in kind of the way you hear it in the film, where it's a slower version. She was phrasing it a little differently, and she has this great breathiness, and it was just great. And it's like, well, this is going to work. And then the next day I called up Edgar and we were chatting about, you know, the shoot had worked and he was happy. And it's like, well, we should do more with it, really, because that's great, you know. And the idea came up that I was always going to use voices in the film. I was always kind of into the idea of a female voice calling through time. But the idea that it could be Anya hadn't occurred to me. And we asked her, you know, would you be up for singing on the film score and being, you know, the session singer sort of for this thing? But how perfect that it's that character. And she was very up for it, and she was fantastic. We went into the studio in British Grove in London. And we spent a day with her doing just going through a load of cues that I'd written, and I'd got parts, and it was this awful situation where I'm kind of just singing, please try this, and my terrible voice singing through to her, and then we track it and layer it, and she's great. You can kind of you know, she brings more to it. You give her the part, but she'll start playing with the part, and gradually we'd get these little things going. And made a massive difference to the score, and meant there's various cues in the center of the film which are really all built around some of these tapestries we built of her voice overlapping and looping around. I might combine bits of dialogue with that as well, and they would loop around too, and you suddenly got these interesting little webs that you could write music around. And after that we ended up doing songs as well. So on the soundtrack record there are 3 cover versions we did with Anya as well. So
oh yeah,
been,
no, they're absolutely wonderful. What's interesting is that Eloise's character, again, another really cool movie. One of my favorite horror films that this reminded me of was A Stir of Echoes. In that you have the visions of this murder that took place in the past.
Right.
And, and Eloise's character is essentially like a psychic, she's supernaturally gifted. And as opposed to Eloise just reading about a cool person or seemingly cool person who lived in her apartment and just doing research without any kind of psychic ability whatsoever, how do you think her God-given abilities kind of opened the score up to take kind of a more fantastical approach than if she didn't have this ability?
Well, I mean, absolutely crucial to the whole thing, setting that up. And she has, her theme in the film is something. I always sort of thought of it as Eloise and the home theme. We always hear it when she's talking to her grandma. We hear it at moments of kind of extreme stress of her, and its origins are a kind of little piano piece where I try to capture that sense of her being a little other, and it's. The actual style of it came out of conversations with Edgar about films like Don't Look Now and those sort of really still kind of sounding piano pieces that you might find in some of those 70s kind of psychological thrillers. And so I was writing in that sort of vein, but it's always sort of lurching a little off. The chords never quite go where they're supposed to, and they kind of drift into slightly strange places. Just as you settle, it sort of sees something out the corner of its eye. That was the feeling I was going for. And so, yeah, that kind of opened up a sort of language really for that side of things, and a lot of sort of sliding harmony stuff going on there, which certainly as things thicken up later on in the film and get more orchestral, I kind of really dug into that side of things.
Now I'm going to be jumping in and out of Soho for our awesome audience questions. We still have some albums to give away. So now here's one from Ivan Sorokin. Which score was most challenging for you? Maybe in an unusual genre, setting, or style?
Within this film, or generally?
Just in general, I guess.
I think they're all pretty challenging at the start of them. It's for me that the challenge is just getting that idea that feels like you can hang the film on it, and sometimes that happens sort of really quickly, and sometimes you're struggling with it. I mean, one of the most satisfying things that I worked on from that perspective was a film called The Aeronauts, where I had a really great conversation with the director Tom Harper pretty early on about, this is all about Victorian England and the people who went up in these gas balloons to unheard of heights, and they were kind of the bravest people, mad people, and just finding something that sounded that it could fit in Victoria, but it also felt unique to their experience. They were going somewhere no one had ever been before. And it's one of those meetings where you sit there and go, oh yeah, it should sound nothing like it. It should sound like nothing else. And everything when we leave the ground should all be powered by wind instruments and then you have to go away and prove that it works. And that was one of those where the only answer to do it was to go in with brilliant musicians and just create sounds, because you couldn't mock it up because the sound doesn't exist. You can't. So many of the sounds in that film are instruments that we made from silly things like getting a wonderful horn player just to blow over the mouthpiece of his instrument and just take that sort of really vaguely resonant sound, but then take that in a number of different, sort of as if he's doing different notes with his lips, and the slight changes in pitch there, and that would become a kind of an air texture, and I might play with that, and that would, all these things in order to prove a concept, in order to write the score. Because without that idea working, you kind of didn't have anything. It needed to feel like that. And so those are the big challenges, I think, when you've set yourself a task of making something very unique to a project, and you then need to find the way to make those instruments and to make that language. That's the most fun bit, as well as the challenge. That's the projects I enjoy the most, of those ones.
I think, that's the big difference between being stuck being a music editor and being a composer, because I know the nightmare of any music editor doing a temp is when some guy says, well, I don't want this to sound like any film score that's ever been written.
Yeah, exactly. And
It's like, oh boy.
it's just not the right stage of the process to say that, is it? That's the and that's
No.
why I think that a lot of people want to start earlier and earlier with their composer. You know, the people. There's a lot of projects I do where people don't want a temp score.
Right.
You know, they want to avoid that phase because they don't want to get attached to something which has been done before. You know, because it is. You know, if a temp has been well done and the scene's playing great, and then you've previewed it and people are going, "Oh, we like the music," you're kind of stuck then with this retread of something else.
Yeah.
And that's where you end up with, you know,
But in cases where you've got
disappointment.
no choice and it's got to get previewed, then you're like, oh boy, I got
That's
what can I find?
and that's where the process can go a little awry. You know, if people get a little reliant on those temp scores, because they can, you know, a well done
Yeah,
temp score can work great.
absolutely. Now here's a question from getting a little feedback here. Here's a question from Louis Versalini. I'm a big fan of Attack the Block. Can you talk about that score? And there are rumors that a sequel's in the works. Any truth to that? And would you be attached to it?
I do know that the sequel's in the works and that it's been announced. And I did see Joe Cornish at the premiere in London for Last Night in Soho, and he's very well, and he's finishing something else at the moment. And I believe they start work on the script. But beyond that, I don't know a thing. I don't know who will be involved. And yeah, I mean, I've just always been immensely grateful that opportunity happened for me, because that was a real life changer. And you know, it was one of those situations where I think they'd had a situation that hadn't worked out, and they needed someone who had both the time and didn't, you know, have a very good fee attached to them. And I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time for that. And it gave me an opportunity to do a film score that then got seen. And without that, you know, I don't think I would ever have got a meeting with Alfonso Cuarón, and you know, all these things wouldn't have happened. I certainly wouldn't have got to do Edgar's next film after that. So it was a lot of fun doing that film, you know. And again, it was a film with a lot of energy, and it felt very fresh. And so musically, you could really have fun with it. And it's such a small orchestra. I think it was 19 players or something like that, but they all got completely, you know, into it, and it sounds huge in places, that score. And looking back on it, I every now and then think of, you know, recapturing some of that energy, you know, working with a smaller group and just going for it a lot more, you know.
Now, I guess my own question for an earlier film, I really enjoyed the Suicide Squad, and I'm talking about, and I love the new one, but I like the first one. And again, there are the rumors of the director's cut, which I'd personally love to see come out. You know, having done a really cool kick-ass score for the first one yourself, I mean, what do you remember as being the big difference between the versions, and would you like to see the director's? 'Cause it seems we're getting director's cuts for everything, and this movie certainly deserves one.
And I just think, you know, that David Ayer was a great chap to work for, and that film was a very unfortunate situation. And the studio itself at that time, and DC, was a bit of a problem. We just got caught in the crossfire, really. And so, you know, it's a niggle of mine that I feel like my one superhero movie was a very compromised thing, and loads of the score I wrote and recorded for that film didn't make it in. And I think, you know, you can read in between the lines if you look at the score album and see some of the track titles on there, and then you realize that those scenes aren't in the film. And you know, there's an awful lot of stuff that I recorded. Those scenes aren't anywhere near the film, and of course you'd like to see things come out as nature intended. Whether it'll ever happen, I have no idea. But yes, it's definitely a niggle of mine. I'd love to one day have another go at a superhero film, and hopefully, you know, it'd be a smoother process than that. But you know, it's every now and then you have an experience in this industry, which, you know, makes you gulp a little bit, but I think makes you stronger in the long term.
Well, again, the movie definitely has its fans. I'm one of them. Now, jumping back into Soho, you know, one thing I really, again, loved about this film in particular, I mean, for me, you know, I've always kind of dug the kind of fanboyish quality of Edgar's work, but this movie to me is his most mature film. And you know, it's very much, it's not about like saying, hey, I love, even though it's about a love of a period, it's not like about, hey, I love this, let me watch me doing this. And I think one big reason the film works so well for me is just how he concentrates on character. And I just love Thomasine Mackenzie as Eloise. Right from the get-go, it's really about her being this messed up girl, and you're really rooting for her as she starts to go crazy. How did you want to musically chart her losing her mind to the point where the score ultimately ends up?
Well, I think that's exactly it. The whole film is hers. It's all we're with her all the way. And these visions that she has, and these sort of out of body experiences almost that she's having. We are seeing it through her eyes a lot of the time. So absolutely everything came through that mirror. And I started this film writing these suites of music called mirror suites, because there's so much imagery of her being seen through mirrors and seeing the reflection of Sandy through a mirror. All of these things. And that all came out of that concept of this reflected life that she was having. And those were the things that I gave to Edgar very early on, and his editor, Paul Matchless, who's also brilliant with music. So the two of them are just a treat to work with. And it was fascinating when they started giving me sequences to work on. All of a sudden, there would be little snippets of these demos that I'd worked before they shot in there. And it was interesting how they arrived at the same kind of solutions, sometimes to placements of themes. I'd always written the little piano thing, thinking that was the Eloise, the Thomasin character, sort of the theme, and they all landed on the same one. So it felt like we were all reading from the same book on that. And yeah, as the film goes through, you definitely feel, I think, the overwhelmed quality that she has, and the dark place that she goes to. And I think the score definitely was allowed to follow that in a very real way.
And again, it's kind of a bitter pill that the film ends up on, because the whole thing is about the illusion of Soho as being this awesome, wonderful place, and especially for Anna's character is that watching the trailer, you think she's a singer, but she really isn't at all. And again, it's just kind of like a sad your dreams are going to get smashed kind of movie. How did that figure, this kind of sense of disappointment, figure into the score? I mean, on both of and especially in Anna's character's case.
Yeah, and I think you feel that certainly towards the end of the soundtrack record, you get the cues that there's a huge mournful quality. There's a track at the end, "You Have to Let Me Go," which is as big as the score gets, and very sort of orchestral moment. And really, that to me always felt like this kind of this funeral piece for the idea of the glory of those era, the death of the particular dream that both the characters kind of share in a funny way. And so, yeah, you got to really, it's a very emotional film, I think. And musically, I was always definitely encouraged to go for that. And I think the fact that we were, also kind of a period film at the same time meant you could be quite honestly emotional in a way that sometimes you're not allowed to do, and certainly that piece, it's a big orchestral piece, and it's quite weighty. And there's a sort of a beautifully played violin solo by a guy called John Mills, who I work with over here a lot. And we did go for it, really, and the music was allowed to be emotional and yeah, hopefully take the audience to that place.
You talk about the mirror imagery in the film, which I think is just really astounding. And half of the time I'm watching, I'm like, how did he do this? How did he achieve this visual trick? How did that dictate to the score? When you would see them together in the frame, or she'd be in a mirror or anything like that. How did that influence the music?
I think it's a lot of reflections are within the music, and reflections and echoes. All of these things became part of it. There's a moment in the film where Anya does her audition, and at the end of it, there's a guy who's sitting there. He's the boss of the club, and he just goes in this brilliant sort of like he's a character actor from the 60s. Well, she can sing, and it's Cockney sort of thing, and that idea of she can sing, and echoing that was the first thing I tried, where I would take the voice and loop it round and have it running on a tape for a long time until it all started to degrade, and keep all that and gradually work out where we wanted those feelings to be, where we wanted the feeling of reality dripping through to the future. And that all came out of that reflection sort of concept, really, the idea that all these mirrors through time, and all these little reflections, and the fact that all these changes in her life had made her what she is in the end of the film. It's sort of, yeah, it all came out of that idea. And as I say, these mirror suites were were key. And the main theme, this little piano theme that's opens the film, was on one of those original tracks. And what usually happens with those early sort of ideas tracks that I would do, I will work on them, and you get to this sort of state in the studio sometimes where you're just hearing the next part, and you overdub this thing, and you play another one, and you're working quickly. You're not really spending time kind of finessing. You're just getting these ideas out with the intent of sort of seeing what you've got, And obviously, one of these sessions, I just got to the end of it and done a little piano overdub at the end of the piece. And somehow, when I sent that piece through to Edgar and Paul, the editor, they'd noted that little bit at the end, got me to send it over in isolation because they'd recognized this little nugget as something that to them felt like the film. And that was kind of an interesting. I've never worked like that before, where someone has kind of extricated what I thought was just a little overdub part that may or may not make the cut, but they saw something in it that then I could develop and play with later on. And it kind of, when I did start to write the score proper, a lot of the thinking had almost sort of happened without me noticing.
Yeah, and then again, going to that is that there are a lot of kind of what I don't know the proper term for it, but it's kind of like these reversed samples in a way, that musically take you back in time. I mean, how did you achieve that effect?
A lot of that is me recording an awful lot of things and then playing with them. I kind of, you can't see much around me at the minute, but there's all sorts of pedals and loops and things like that. I come from a guitar playing background, so you have a lot of effects pedals and ways of changing the sound and that sort of thing. And I set my studio up so I can send anything to any of these things at any point and just see what happens. I'm a big fan of sort of lucky mistakes, really. And the amount of times you press stop on your computer that you're working with, and the delay will do something interesting, and you wish you could keep that. I've kind of worked out ways that I can keep that stuff. And often I'll record an awful lot of things and then just play with it and see what happens if I get a vocal line and distort it and loop it around, and then what happens when that's playing in relation to another thing, and maybe they're going to create a little harmony. And all it takes is for you to just recognize a little bit of something, and then all of a sudden you're playing along. And it's amazing how the film, if you've extricated things from the film like that, the film is kind of teaching you how to write music for it. And that's become a bit of the process. If I have the right sort of project and the time to experiment, those things tend to come up with something, with a little nugget of something that just gives you something to chase and follow.
Now, what was your research like for the film? What was your homework in terms of older songs or soundtracks to listen to, movies to watch when you were preparing to do this?
Well, in terms of the 60s music, this project was just a gift because that's the stuff I grew up with. My folks are that era. And so I learned to talk by playing records that my mum claims. I would put the record on when I was really, really little, crawling from speaker to. They had speakers either side of this big bit of furniture, and I used to crawl from side to side because you'd get a different sort of experience on those early stereo mixes. So I kind of remember doing bits of that. So the music of that era is my thing. And there's a scene early in the film when Eloise is packing a suitcase to move to London, and she puts all her vinyl records in there. And every single one of those is like a favorite record of mine. So in that sense, I was in a good place with this. And then film wise, Edgar's, when I spoke with him very early on, he was watching a lot of films shot in the 60s, and, things like Beat Girl, which is a John Barry score, 1960, which there's actually a snippet of in the film. Stuff like that. But a lot of psychological horror stuff too. I mentioned Don't Look Now earlier on, and that was one. And The Shining was another thing that, there's scares in our film which kind of feel linked to that to me, and uses of voice and things like that, which, it just made me think of there's a feeling of some of those films where you feel like you're living inside the film a bit. And that was very influential. Just that feeling of you feel like you're sinking into the picture. And that's what we wanted to capture with this.
Did you get to go to the film set while they were shooting it? I imagine this was shot way pre-pandemic.
It was just before the pandemic. Yeah, I went once when we did the audition with Anya. I'm not great on film sets. I find the process very, very slow, and I like seeing it and seeing. It's good to walk around a set and to get a sense of the scale of it, and it's great to see lighting and things like that. I always find that really useful. Just the colors of things seems to make a massive difference to where I go with it. And I've always struggled with writing off scripts, because until I've seen how it looks and how they've shot it and how they've lit it, a bit of my brain doesn't work out what the instrumentation should be. So it's I saw bits of that, and I saw rushes and things like that early on, and they were really, really helpful. But yeah, I don't tend to spend that much time on sets. It's nice to go and meet people, but not for too long.
What was the whole pandemic scoring process like for you on this?
Well, it was delayed. I mean, initially we were going to record this in March 2020. And in fact, I went in, the last time I went into London for a very long time was, I live just outside central London. And so I went in for a meeting in Soho with Edgar on March the 20th. And we were going to record a couple of weeks after that. They were going to do a bit of additional shooting. And literally while I was having my meeting about what we were going to record, we got the call that London was shutting down, the shoot was shutting down. And we kind of went into a bit of limbo with it, really, and came back. And I ended up recording it in around late September of last year. So there was a good 6 months there. And we were kind of working through it as well. But there was this opportunity to come back and I take a little bit of a break from it and then come back and see it afresh. And that was amazing because you could kind of, you always sort of find little bits that, oh, actually, why was I using that bit there? You know, that's too much there. I need to do something else. And I got like the second bite of the cherry to do it. And then by the time we did record, London had been operational, sort of recording studios wise, for a couple of months by then, 2-3 months. And so people were getting the hang of the socially distanced recording. And we had to do, you know, strings, brass, woodwind separately and things like that, which has become the norm. I tend to do quite a lot of that anyway on other films because I tend to play with things after I've recorded them. So it wasn't so different for me. But what was nice about this was we got to come back in June of this year, 2021, and just do these additional songs that we've done for the marketing and for the soundtrack albums. And that was great because we managed to get more people in the room by then because the pandemic was in a better state over here for a period. And that was great because we were trying to recreate the sound of a 60s session, you know, and we did quite authentic versions of a couple of songs from the film with Anya singing. And that was tremendous because we had the musicians in the room, backing vocals, the band, the orchestra, all together in the same room that, you know, You're My World by Cilla Black was recorded back in '64. And that was magical. And the players hadn't done much of that in the previous year and a bit. And so that was glorious because it just, you got a sense of how amazing those arrangements were and how amazing those days were where you just go in and you record 3 or 4 songs that day and they would be done, finished, keepers, great. And just a sense that excitement of doing a take, you know, rather than getting each element and just, you know, putting a bit of music together like a jigsaw, actually having everyone sitting in the room and responding to each other and, you know, suddenly going for the one, you know, let's go for the one take and no edits, just boom, that. And so we did a lot of recording over the period and we've tried all different sorts on this one.
Yeah, it's really weird because when I've been to a couple of sessions, I don't get how they just record separate instruments or, you know, brass or percussion. And again, it seemed to me that what's really missing is just the joy of all the instruments playing together, you know, pre-pandemic or whatever. I mean,
there's definitely a sense in the room, you know, it's a more technical process when you stripe it out. And often you have to because they're still changing the film and, you know, there's things that are going to be recut afterwards. And so there's a certain amount of you know, just doing your best for the projects in those sorts of situations. Whereas there's something to be said. When I started out, you know, in films back in the late 90s, there was a period of time where physically the cutting had to stop because they were going to make physical copies of the film. And you'd have this period in which scoring would happen, 6 to 8 weeks or whatever, where the picture wasn't changing at all. And I think that led to a lot of bravery from composers because you weren't having to worry about, you know, I've got to get from this frame to this frame and they might change that. So, I've got to make, you know, I'll do this in ordered blocks or whatever it might end up sounding like. You could actually be really committed to it. And that's something that, you know, when I have had the opportunity to work on pretty much lock cuts, you do feel much more confident in your ability to do that. And part of the reason I try and start early on projects now is like, if you can really make a piece of music work, it's very hard for them to change it. You know, if you can really get that music so it has to sit there and everyone's happy with how that music's falling, you can sometimes make something really distinctive stick for, you know, in a much more original way.
Now, another big part of your career is doing nature documentary scoring. You know, you won an Emmy with David Attenborough. Tell me about that whole genre and the and what makes that different from like doing a score.
Well, in some ways, it's like I imagined doing a score used to be, and that's certainly been something I've enjoyed about it over a few years. I mean, I took on my first one back in 2015, and I'd got an inquiry about going for a meeting in Bristol, where a lot of the filmmakers are based, to talk about this BBC show called The Hunt. And I had absolutely no intention of doing it because I was, just off the back of Gravity and things, and I was in a lucky position of having a few offers, and it was really not a sensible thing to do. And I went for the meeting, and they showed me the footage, and I said yes immediately, because it was just these amazing stories and these amazing images, and space for music, and real respect for music, and real just this they believe that music can help tell their stories in a way that is really sort of refreshing. And it was lovely to work on. And I did a show called The Hunt, and then I did a thing called Our Planet in 2019, and a few things around that, including the David Attenborough movie that you mentioned. And it's been a lovely part of life. It allows me to write in a different way, a much more melodic, orchestral, expansive kind of style than I do for other things. And I enjoy the variety, really. I love the opportunity to write like that, and to be really melodious. I do like writing melodies, and I love an orchestra playing them, and it's an absolute treat to do that stuff. But I also love this other stuff, and I love the electronic playing with things, and I love trying to make something really unique. So it's been a nice sort of balance over the last few years of trying to keep both threads running, really.
Now, here's a question from Jimmy Lehman. How many mock-ups have you had to make for each film, and is the feedback loop faster or slower over your progressing career?
There's no faster or slower. Certainly, it just absolutely depends on the project. And on every film, there seems to be one cue where one cue will go through, pretty much first time, no notes, and then another one I'll still be fiddling with the version, God knows how many. I mean, the one thing about the film Gravity, I remember when we get to the sessions, we usually have the version number, how many versions of the demo I've done written on the score, because that means we can keep track of things, and my music editor will know which version, and we know which picture version, all these sort of things that go on. And I remember taking them off on Gravity because I was so paranoid that the musicians would see these incredibly high version numbers and assume I was an absolute idiot. But sometimes it just goes like that, and I very rarely regretted doing another version of anything. That even if you end up going, I don't like this one as much, you'll have learned something through that process, and there might be a little sound that came out of that extra revision, which is useful when you come back to it. And you'll have, I've never regretted it once. And it's one of the things that I always have to remind myself, because we're all human, right? And when you get someone saying, I don't like that, it's not a nice feeling. But it's kind of good as well, because you've got through that now. That one exists. You're never going to do that piece of music again. You've freed up the way to write in the next one, and you've kind of given yourself the opportunity to do something good and something that you haven't done before, and you have to dig a little bit deeper. So yeah, the version numbers, I would not trust the process if I hadn't done a lot of versions of things. I wouldn't feel like I've worked it out for myself, because even during the final mix of a film, something will happen where you go, oh, that's the solution. And it's one of the things I learned from working for some really great people over the years, is that you might get that solution at any time. So absolutely keep going until they tell you to stop, really.
Now, another movie you scored with an absolute batshit reveal, maybe even more batshit than Last Night in Soho, and a really fun movie is Sweet Girl, an action movie on Netflix. What was that experience like?
Well, that was another pandemic project. So the last time I went to America actually was for a set visit for that film, and that was lovely people, and the thing with that film was trying to make it feel like the environment it was shot in. It was all shot in Pittsburgh, and it had a sort of definite feel to it, and the whole film was, as you say, there is a very strange reveal in it, and the idea of the film, the score feeling kind of off before you get to that point, and feeling like things were kind of running slightly out of kilter and were feeling a little dirty, and the whole orchestra in that film was continually distorted, and we'd almost in the mix play the distortion. You'd kind of have all the orchestral tracks going through various different processes, and I would kind of perform it on faders, and find the point at which it felt just like something was a little bit wrong, and something was a little bit kind of just niggling you around the back of the head. So it was a lot of fun to do. We've got some great performances on that film, and we recorded it all in London. And it was a nice experience, that one, and some lovely people. Jeff Fearson, the producer, and Brian Mendoza, the director, were lovely people to work with and to get to know.
Now, one of my favorite scores that you've done, and actually one of my favorite science fiction films in recent memory, and maybe even the best trick reveal of them all, is Archive. I urge everyone to watch this amazing film. Tell me about scoring that.
Well, that was just one of these amazing sort of things that come out of the blue. I was dropping off my daughter at school one day, and a chap came up to me and asked my name, and he turned out he was a friend of this director who had written a script. And there's a bit of you at a moment like that goes like, oh right, okay, great. And then they send me the script, and it was fantastic. And it's a chap called Gavin Rothery, who people knew best as one of the creative people behind the film Moon, Duncan Jones and Moon, Sam Rockwell film from about 10, 11 years ago now. And he'd been working on this film for years, and he'd got the funding together to do it. Very, very low budget film. But I read the script, and it was fantastic. And then I met with him, and he showed me the designs and all this bit, because he's a designer by training, and brilliant, and just he was going to pull it off. And they had no money, and it was just a great idea. And I saw a bit of it, and it was fantastic. So it says something for my incredible sense of timing that was the last project I did pre-pandemic, and it was an entirely electronic score that I did sitting on my own in a room. And then the film that I was doing during the pandemic was a big animated film with a full orchestra. So my timing was slightly askew for the whole thing. But I had a whale of time making that score, because it was a lot of electronics, but gradually becoming more kind of soulful, and a lot of solo cello coming in as the film developed, as the idea being that this guy was inventing a most advanced form of AI, and he would go through these versions, J1 being the sort of version where the AI was only capable of thought of around about an 8-9-year-old child, and then the next model could be a 15-16-year-old, and then gradually he was recreating someone he knew. And so the music could get more sophisticated and more human as the process went through. It was a lot of fun to work on. I'm really proud of that film, actually, and it's always a thrill when people have seen it.
So David Sayas Bonestra says, hello from Barcelona, and congrats on your Last Night in Soho score. He loved how you achieved to make a lovely Burt Bacharach sound menacing in the Oxford circus scene. Apart from that, what were your main inspirations for the score? I guess maybe even in terms of just so beautifully replicating the kind of reverb sound of those classic songs and scores.
Yeah, I mean, you were basically, you look at the 60s, and there's moments where in my head that I was drawing on John Barry-esque ideas. I mean, there's moments in a cue like Neon, which starts the soundtrack record, where it gets quite sort of, brassy and kind of bold. You were kind of trying to just capture some of that spirit of the 60s, but then have it sort of transported to the future. So I enjoyed playing, big brass melody lines and things like that. Was fun to really go quite bold on. And, there's other moments where it's Ennio Morricone kind of techniques where these little mobile things of harpsichords and celestes and those there's a sort of moments in the film where I was definitely kind of feeling influenced by that sort of stuff. And Dino Panaggio stuff where Pino Donaggio stuff, got totally wrong way around. That sort of that sort of feeling stuff where really quite bold string moves and that sort of thing, they were all kind of knocking around in my brain during the making of this, because conversations with Edgar really about those sort of movies.
How did you want to spot the film? Again, in relation to the songs, again, there's this great moment in it, and it reminds me of the ramp up in, Eleanor. I'm terrible with the Beatles songs, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
all I can say, it's the part in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the movie, where that woman jumps off the church roof, and I just don't know what the so you know what I'm talking about, that great orchestral rise to the
day in the life kind of
day in the life. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Day in the life.
So spotting, it just evolves through the films really. And what would tend to happen is that the cutting room would kind of work with whether it be a song or score demos of mine, and at some point it would be passed back to me in a kind of, well, the blocks sort of ideas are here, but what can we actually do? And then I would kind of work on it, and just build things and try and make every moment feel like it belonged, send it back in, and we just have this really quick dialogue, and we all work very fast together. So it's this great thing of literally during a day a scene might change 4 or 5 times, and I might sort of change the score for it 4 or 5 times, but by the end of that day we'll have got through that bit. And I'm doing this all through the assembly, so when the director's cut is going on, so really early on, before normally a composer would come on board, I would be pretty much live composing in my studio and sending things back and forth at quite a pace, just so we have a film to watch. And I remember, we did the entire director's cut like that, and then screened it, and then we could kind of see what was working and what wasn't. And that's a great place to be, where you can actually watch the whole movie with, even if it's quite early demos, you just get a sense of what's going to work, what's not going to work, where your strengths are, and where the bits you have to work are. And we would keep doing that. We'd just keep watching the film again, and the spotting would kind of evolve, and you soon realize in those sort of things, and certainly if you put it in front of an audience, you realize where the moments where things need trimming and and maybe the music was slowing it down, maybe the music was making it go too fast, maybe we were too big too soon. All of these things, you just get a sense where you've got people and where you're losing people. And at the end of the day, you just want people to have this journey where the film just feels like it absolutely flows, and the momentum is there, and each scene pulls you into the next, and you can't look away. And we just kept chipping away at it until it felt like that.
So again, the day in the life thing was just, or am I just the only one reading into that?
Well, there's a few builds where we got to. Sometimes it would just come out of knowing you needed to overwhelm an audience, and you need to feel that bit. And so an orchestral crescendo, an electronic crescendo, whatever it may be, you'd end up sort of doing these things, and you try all sorts of different methods. There's certainly a couple of moments where the orchestra were given that instruction to, start on this note and get to this note, do it in whatever way you want to do it. And that's a very day in the life kind of thing. So yeah, there's certainly not above drawing on that sort of wonderful stuff.
Now, I guess you're going to be back in the world of science fiction with your next project, which is called Distant, and I believe it's a movie about an asteroid. What can you tell us?
Well, I can tell you it's an Amblin project that I recorded over the summer, and which recorded in LA, which was just a treat, and some amazing musicians. So it was just an amazing experience to me to hear it all come back. And it's a very different sounding score, certainly from the one we talked about today. It's it is an Amblin film, so it's an action adventure, but it's set on an alien planet, and there's been a crash landing, and there seem to be 2 survivors, and it's a tale of how they find each other. So there's adventure, there's action, there's sci-fi, there's orchestra, there's synths, but there's romance as well. And it's a very thematic score, and I'm really looking forward to people seeing that film next year. I think it's out in around about March time. I could be wrong, but that's present theory.
Very, very cool. Well, I guess to wrap up our show, this is a very educational movie, I think, in terms of people, who may not have Edgar Wright's amazing knowledge of the late 60s. I just personally love the era. I love all the songs and the scores from it. But do you think in a way that your score, the film itself, is kind of like an educational gateway to appreciate the era and, dig deeper into the songs and the scores, hopefully without murder being involved?
Well, yeah, hopefully that. Yeah, well, I mean, my memory of my relationship with music in the early days was the thing where you'd hear something you liked, and you would go in around it. You'd kind of do your research around it. You'd go like, oh, that person played on that record. They played on this record, and gradually you'd build that up. And you'd hear a song like Paperback Writer. It's based on a novel by a man named Lear. Who's Lear? You'd go and find out about him, and gradually you'd build that. And Edgar's films are incredible for that. There's so many references in there, and it's one of those films, I think, if you see it more than once, you realize how much is planted in there, and how many little tidbits there, both for the story itself and little references to other things. And yeah, it's I don't know if describing it as educational would be the thing I'd do, but it's certainly it's very interested in everything around it. And I think it's to me, it's a very sort of inspiring film to introduce you to lots of other things, and that era and that genre of filmmaking as well. He's playing with genres in a really interesting way in this film, and I think it opens doors to a lot of things. He's done a few things where he's talked about his film influences and his record influences on this film, and there's some really fascinating stuff in there.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's my favorite Edgar Wright movie. It's my favorite score that you've done for him. And again, just terrific work. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us at Film Music Live, Stephen.
No, thank you. It's lovely to talk to you.
It's great having you here. I want you all to go see Last Night in Soho. It's in movie theaters with its soundtrack available on Backlot Music. And I want to give a big thanks to our show's executive producer, Mark Northam, producer Dale Turner, and publicist Jeff Sanderson and Nikki Walsh at Backlot Music. And we're going to see you next time at Film Music Live, where we will go ghost busting with Rob Simonson. All right. See everybody. Thanks for joining in.